Hello, and welcome to the 13th episode in our series, The End of the World as You Know It, a condensed version of end time prophecy. I'm your guest speaker, Dr. Scott McKenzie, and today we'll discuss Revelation chapter 12, written by the Apostle John. As you know, the seventh trumpet has sounded, and John finds himself 3.5 years into the tribulation. We know the tribulation lasts for 7 years. Now, here in chapter 12, John is going to be given a history lesson that focuses on Israel's past and future, a future that we are studying about in the book of Revelation. So let's look at verse 1, where John sees a woman representing Israel. I believe that she does represent Israel because of the 12 stars. And then in verse 2, because of Mary, Israel is pictured as giving birth to Jesus, their Messiah. In verse 3, you read a description of Satan, who convinced 1/3 of the angels in heaven to follow him in his rebellion against God. It was Satan who moved King Herod to slaughter the boys in Bethlehem, hoping to kill Jesus, Israel's Messiah, their future king, and our Savior. We know this about Jesus because of the description in verse 5. You see, after Jesus was crucified, he ascended back into heaven, as verse 5 tells you. And with that, John's history lesson is over, bringing John into the future again in the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. Now, I want you to know verse 6 here is out of chronological order with what is happening in verse 7, so don't let that freak you out. It's really part of the events described in verses 13 through 17. So let's forget about verse 6 for now and focus on the events in verses 7 through 12, which describe for you a war in heaven. And if I understand this correctly, this war takes place before the future world leader, possibly claiming to be Islam's 12th Imam, is assassinated. But back to the battle, a battle that Satan loses. He is then kicked out of heaven with his demons, and their entrance passes have been taken away. So the now humiliated Satan takes out his anger on mankind, men who are created in the image of God, the God who just defeated Satan. And that's why in verse 12, an angel said, "Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows his time is short." This is when Satan possesses and resurrects the slain world president. This is when Satan sets up his image, desecrating the temple. This is why Jesus said in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 24, verses 15 and 16, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." The Apostle Paul confirmed this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, when he wrote, "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." Which, by the way, is what you have described here in Revelation chapter 12, verse 14. Then, in verse 15, you have the attempt of the Antichrist to annihilate those in Israel fleeing from this man claiming to be their God. A man who has desecrated their temple with his image. A man demanding everyone worship him as God, just as the Caesars of old in the ancient Roman Empire. Well, God defeats the Antichrist's attempt to annihilate those Israelis fleeing to a place where they will be supernaturally protected by God during the last 3.5 years. Where is this place, you ask? That has been the debate taking place for many years. Some believe God's safe haven for Israel is at the ancient site Petra. And yet Petra isn't mentioned in biblical prophecy. But there is a place mentioned in biblical prophecy, and that would be Bozrah. Let me read to you what the prophet Isaiah wrote in chapter 63, verses 1 through 4. This is what Isaiah wrote. Who is this that comes from Edom, with dyed garments from Bozrah, this one who is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength? I, who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red, and your garments like one who treads the winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. For I have trodden them in my anger, and trampled them in my fury. Their blood is sprinkled upon my garments, and I have stained all my robes. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed has come. The prophet Isaiah knew that he was writing about the Messiah, and that's why I believe Bozrah is the location that the Israelis will flee to. Now, concerning the Messiah's stained robes mentioned in Isaiah, Revelation chapter 14 describes how this happened. It's a description of the future battle of Armageddon when Jesus returns to defeat the armies of the world. And so, class, we have moved from the tribulation of the first 3.5 years to the beginning of the last 3.5 years, bringing us to the end of our study today. And even so, remember this. Remember what Jesus said. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. And so until next time, my friends, farewell.